All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Deconstruction Zone. We're virtual again, but we're going to have a good time. How are you doing, Danny?
I'm good. I didn't say we weren't going to talk about this, but this is our second time trying to record this because Grace keeps ruining everything. So we're back at it again. We're recording in our houses. Life's a lot harder outside the podcast dungeon, but we're making it work.
We are making it work. I will say one of the other podcasts I listen to, it's always their cats is the issue, which feels like even less
Mm.
intense. But you'll just hear like pots and pans clanging in the back, and she'll be like, "Sorry, I guess my cats are in the kitchen." So it
I
happened.
think I was pretty cool to let it ride, except for I kept losing my train of thought, and I was like, I can't do this question you're giving me justice while I'm also trying to manage, which I'm still going to be managing Grace in the background, but hopefully we'll be able to make. Oh, I think I just heard my wife get home, so that means that we got this.
Boom, we're gonna
Um,
nail it.
we're gonna nail it. But hey, so what are we talking about today? What's our topic? What are we talking about?
My boyfriend and I watched the show The Squid Game, The Challenge on Netflix,
Okay.
which I gotta say, we've been recommending it to everyone. I guess I would say I recommend it. You do get pretty into it
Okay.
and it is pretty interesting. And some of the games they pick are like different than the original show. And so sometimes everyone will be like, oh, we know this game is going to be such and such, but then it's like not that. And
Oh,
so like
interesting.
yeah, and so I it is pretty cool, and some of the games are like, who are the people that created this game? Because that is genius and so difficult. Anyway, but there's been a bit of controversy around that show because people said they like weren't treated very well. Some people said they like
Yeah.
lost the first game, the red light, green light, because apparently they were like waiting outside for like hours in the cold rain. And then the game in red light, green light is like you have to freeze at red light. And they
Yeah.
were like, I'm shivering. And so
Yeah.
like
Make it hard.
right. So I think a lot of people were pissed. Um anyway, however, I think Tyler and I's biggest critique of the show is it just generally felt very dramatic. Partly
Okay.
because instead of like killing the people, they just like got out, but which is good. Good change.
Yeah. Keep them alive.
But they had like this necklace that had like a little like thing of ink, and when they would like get out of the game, their necklace would like explode, and then they would have to fall down and pretend to be dead, which is like
Did they have
kind
to
of
do it like from?
unnecessary.
Like, was that a part of it? They were like had to like theatrically die, or they just like fell down. They're like, well, I guess I'm out of this game.
It depended on the person. I think if someone was like pissed enough that they lost, that they were just like whatever, and just like fell over. But at the beginning, people were a little more dramatic about it because I guess they were told to. I don't know, but it was
Yeah.
weird and
Okay.
unnecessary, but entertaining. But what we also noticed is like as the show progressed, there was like so much crying, like
Okay.
a ridiculous amount of crying. And I don't like to say a ridiculous amount of crying because I'm a crier. I am a frequent crier, and I think that there's like a lot of good and a lot of beauty in letting your emotions out. But it was getting to a
Yeah.
point where I was like, this is too
Yeah.
much.
Even
Like,
Emily's
chill
is like,
out.
stop crying. Like, just let it. Just get it up. We're done. We got
If I say stop crying, that means there's like a lot of crying.
it.
um, but because it just kind of felt like, okay, you didn't get the money. I totally get that that sucks. That's a life-changing amount of money, 100%. But like, I don't think every single thing needs to like make you burst into tears.
Sure.
However, so that I was saying that a lot, Tyler was saying that a lot, but then we were reading about their experiences because a lot of the what is it not components, contestants were talking about their experience, and they were like, it was terrible, and like they were like, you have to remember that we wake up at 6 a.m., go to bed at 11 p.m. We're with a bunch of strangers. The beds suck, like, we're not getting good sleep, and it is pretty intense. We're, like, playing a lot of games. Like, the longer you are in there, the longer you are, like, sleep deprived, they didn't feed us well, like, things
Yeah.
start to feel like a bigger and bigger deal if you are not mentally and physically in a good spot.
Yeah.
And so that I was like, "You know what? That's, like, a really good point," like, but what I think why I was able to relate to them is because it made me think of church camp.
Yeah.
Because in church camp, you don't get good sleep for a multitude of reasons. And I don't usually the food is like not it. And so
I agree.
everything just slowly and slowly gets more and more emotional, um, like throughout camp, culminating in usually this like massive worship night on the last day that everyone's just sobbing their eyes out. People are recommitting their life to Christ or committing it for the first time, like all that. And but it's like, okay, how much of this is real and how much of this is like pure sleep deprivation and like emotional intensity that is caused by
Yeah.
other factors. So I just want to start off, I guess, first. I'll talk a little bit more about my experience, but what was your experience with church camp?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we had different ones because I went to real church camp. You went to apologetics camp. Those are very different things. But no. So I think I went as a high schooler. I also went as a leader a few times. Um, and I had never heard it called this, but Sadie calls the final night cry night. Like they specifically talk about it that way. I had never heard it that way. But in hindsight, I'm like, yeah, everyone cried. Like it was people were bawling. And so for me though, like camps, Christian camps, or like conferences, like I went to a thing called CHIC, which I can't even remember what that stands for, but it was some acronym. Oh, Covenant High, like high schoolers in Christ was the name of was the acronym, and I like that was 1,000 like 5,000 person youth high school youth conference. Everyone across the country in our denomination came to it. I did that as a junior or senior maybe, and I remember liking all of them, being like I like the people. Like I do remember feeling some sort of emotional spiritual connection, like I'm getting deeper, but like I'm not a big like emotional worshiper. So I remember like everyone, like people that weren't like raising their hands and worshiping, and like, oh, that's kind of interesting, and like people like bawling on the last night and like and being like, I want to accept Jesus as my savior, as you said. And like I don't remember thinking it was like sleep deprivation or like manipulative, but I do remember thinking like it is odd that everything is culminating at the end. But even like thinking back on some of it, like I remember the workshops that when I went to this thing called Chick, like I went to one about like purity, and they're like asking every guy, it's like only guys in the room, like who's masturbated, and if anyone like raises their hand, they're just getting like roasted for it. And other ones about like sin and shame, and like pretty like everything was kind of like building up in many ways to like tear you down so that you would then rely on Christ more. Which, and I'm like, rely on Christ, like accept Jesus, like I'm all here for all of that. But I think it makes sense of like the emotion at the end, much like Squid Game. It's like a lot of tearing you down so that when you get the prize or you don't get it, you're like really emotional about it. Um, and then as a leader, I just remember like being wanting to be there for like the kids and stuff, and like they were really emotional, but I don't think I made the connection that we're making now to like that idea of like we're beating you down, and we tried not to do that, but like the idea of the week really beating you down through food and sleep and exhaustion and teaching and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, like it wasn't definitely, it has a place in my history, in a place of like prominence and good memories. I don't really have any bad ones, but I don't know, what was your experience like?
So it's, I think it's definitely, I want to like talk more about, because I think we've both experienced it as a participant and also as a leader, which I think are
Yeah.
different experiences that I think like say a lot. But I'll start as like as a goer. I didn't really go a lot in elementary school and middle school. There was like a few like salt and light camp. Was that a thing with everyone or just the Presbyterians? Okay.
Never heard of it.
Well, I never got to go to Salt and Light, but it seemed like the coolest thing ever. Um, in hindsight, it probably wasn't, but but in high school, I went with a friend to a non-denom one, so it was already like kind of off the walls, right?
Right. At this point,
um,
you're already halfway to hell, right?
I remember that they used the message translation, and
Oh,
we got back to our cabin, and my friend and I were like, I don't know why they just want to water down the Bible like that. Like we were just annoying, so annoying. But I remember like in general, I remember being there and slowly there had been a lot going on in my life when I first went to church camp. So I was like emotional kind of for other reasons. We had like had a classmate die, and I had just found out we were like moving cities in the middle of high school. So I was like very overwhelmed. And I remember like at one point, I was like definitely crying. And I was talking to a leader, and she was like, first of all, I just need to ask, like, have you accepted Jesus into your heart? And I was very offended. I was like, I guess I'm not showing my faith enough that she even had to ask that. Like, I thought about that for like
Right.
years probably, but that is like totally real. I definitely thought about that for so long and felt a lot of shame about it. Anyway,
I can
all that
imagine.
to say, right. I mean, I was, which, it's an okay question to ask. Like, she didn't do anything wrong necessarily. I just felt deep shame about that. Um, but all that to say, leading up to it, the food sucked. Like, we got almost no sleep, partly because we were talking, partly because like the beds are uncomfy. Like, there's so many things about it. And eventually it kind of led up to cry night or whatever, and it was very emotional, and I felt very moved. And but what was so interesting is I remember coming back to like my home church and telling people like, yeah, I went to this camp and like had a really good experience, like felt very connected to God, like all this. And they were just like, but then I was also like, but they used the message. but but they were all like warning me about like, okay, well, that is just a mountaintop experience. Like you can't,
Hmm.
that doesn't really mean anything. Like that is not reliable. What's reliable is like the truth of scripture. Like don't listen to your feelings. I guess it's cool that you had that, but like that doesn't really mean a lot. Which I think is kind of
Yeah.
fascinating that churchgoers were saying that to me because I'm assuming that's not what you were told if like the first time you had like a mountaintop camp experience.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like unique to your. I mean, you've talked about this throughout the course of the podcast of like you were taught not to rely on your feelings. And actually, like I was told you a little bit before we went, like I went back and listened to the first episode, and pretty much everything in your initial chapter, as we called it last episode of deconstruction, is based in you having no autonomy and no agency. And so the idea that like you would do anything or it like wouldn't be the Bible driving it, like anything outside of that was sinful in many ways. And so yeah, it's like a very interesting thing. And like for us, like we would have said like caution people like, hey, mountaintop experiences, they're not everything and they're not everywhere, and you need to like not always live on the mountaintop because life is sometimes in the valley. But we would have never like discredited it to be like, well, this is just like your emotions misleading you or something. It's like, well, God was in that mountaintop moment. But you have to remember that not every moment will be a mountaintop moment in your life, would probably of something I would have heard. But I think you probably would have heard more negative about it as it could be like a distraction from your actual faith, right?
Yeah, like a distraction, or I think partly they did say maybe like don't chase those experiences, which I do understand, but I think the Presbyterian Church definitely emphasized like so this a little bit off topic but pretty on topic. I read David Platt's book Radical. Did you ever read that book?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Um, yeah, actually, I think it was like the first small groups. I think it came with like a small group study, and it was like the first ever youth pastor. Like I led either my leaders or people in my youth group through this book. I'm almost positive.
Okay. Fun fact, I actually have a on the radical.com website, there's an article written by yours truly on there.
Oh,
So
well, look at
I don't
that.
even know
Let's
how
go
that
find it.
happened, but should we find it? I don't I don't even know what it's about. Are you looking it up right now?
No, I'm not looking at that, but I will immediately after this episode. I'm going to go find it.
Right. But what someone I think in the PCA or PCA adjacent wrote a rebuttal book called Ordinary. And his
Oh,
whole point was like, and he talked about like a sustainable, like a steadfast, sustainable faith. And so basically, instead of like being radical, being like all in, like that's can you hear the barking?
Oh no, I can't. I thought, well, maybe I thought maybe it just assumed because it's muted that it's happening outside of my headphones that are noise canceling.
Oh, but anyway, sorry about that. But basically his whole thing was like, don't chase these like radical experiences. Don't be on fire for God. Be like steadfast in an ordinary churchgoer. And so I remember reading
mm,
that and being like, this is exactly it. Like no mountaintop experiences. And I think realistically, I did have a youth pastor actually who felt like he had both books in his office, and I remember he pulled them out and he was like, I think that we need to like put these together and find a middle ground because I think both of these are hitting on a huge extreme, which I think that's like what I needed to hear in the moment because I think,
Yeah.
yeah, like I definitely think that there is a beauty in like a steadfast, sustainable faith versus like chasing big experiences and then feeling nothing. But that also doesn't mean we need to like invalidate those big experiences.
Yeah. You know, like honestly, as you're talking, and I'm just thinking about this through the lens of deconstruction, like why would a pastor say that? And it's like, well, and this is maybe somewhat unfair of a characterization, but why would a pastor in the caricature I painted of them, of what you've told me in your upbringing, tell you that? Well, because we don't want the person to feel too good about themselves and become too autonomous and have too much like thought and too many like I think the idea that you start to like have a spirituality where you feel good, where you feel great, where you're not like always looking at the negative sinful aspects of yourself because you're ultimately that's all you are. Like in your upbringing, it's like not like you've used this. I don't have cancer. I am cancer, right? Like my identity is bad and God loves me despite that and actually like kind of doesn't love that part about me but chooses to include me anyway. And so like I think about like, well, why would we want to tell people all the time you're ordinary, you're ordinary, you're ordinary, or like find God in the ordinary? Because we find God in the mountaintops, I think we start to like become maybe I don't like we move. I just listened to a podcast about cults, and so I have this like cult mentality in my mind, and it feels like you're breaking outside of the cult in some ways, and like the structures that have like kept you in it. And that's like a little bit of a mean and maybe unfair characterization, but it sounds like a control method of like ordinary, ordinary, ordinary. Like the mountaintops pull you out of that, and so we want to make sure you just realize your baseline is like God is mundane, you are mundane, everything is mundane. You know?
Yeah, well, I think like as you're talking, like every time you said like, okay, but feeling this way or feeling this way, I was like, that's what we were against is like any sort of reliance on feelings because feelings weren't reliable. God is reliable, the Bible's reliable. And so I think this is maybe an extreme as well, but I think in a sense that book Ordinary, um, like in a sense, robots could do it. Like they could do everything that
Yeah.
he said versus like a mountaintop experience or a radical experience is very like feelings oriented. And I think that, at least in the tradition I came from, feelings were any sort of reliance on feelings or any sort of like listening to feelings or trust in feelings was bad because like one, that's our sinful nature. So like why are you listening to something that's rooted in your sinful nature? And true, it's not or and second, it's not like steadfast and unreliable and reliable like the Bible. Like the Bible stays the same and your feelings don't. And so they were very much like, what can we do that is predictable and like anti feelings? And to me, the answer is like
Yeah.
Michael Horton's book, Ordinary, which is interesting.
Yeah. What what is like your I mean if the what is your most reliable thing in your life as far as like guiding principles and faith like what is your most reliable thing like you're going through life and you're like here's my compass north my star or whatever like this is what I point back to like what is that for you these days?
Real talk, I kind of feel like when mm, I kind of feel like when you let go of the Bible as that, I don't think I personally ever fully replace that with anything. At least not to the same extent. Like at least not to this like this is inerrant, this is like what you follow 100%. It's a very good question. Um I think for a while there, like especially in those earlier episodes, I was talking a lot about how can I listen to my intuition and listen to my body? And I think for a while I was trying to make myself that constant. I don't really know if I still feel that way. I think that that's a very good question that I don't have the answer to right now.
I would say that is quite an astute observation of where you were, because I would have said the same thing after listening to a couple episodes today. Is I could tell there was a season, and you didn't do it like in a sacrilegious way or like an arrogant way, but I did see you shifting from like the Bible is not the ultimate authority, but I like, and you would have said me and my body, my feelings, like my visceral reactions to things are. And that's interesting, like just to hear you say that, because that was as I was listening in my car by myself. That was kind of something that I was hearing, and I wasn't necessarily like this is good or bad, but I could just hear the shift happening in you of like what is my like really in many ways like your authority shifted to like, and you said this like, what is it, I mean you said the thing of like bad psychology can't be, or good theology can't be bad psychology, but also like God wouldn't, like if my body was having a bad reaction to something that was a truth, then it couldn't be from God. And so in that you were like, well, I get to be the ultimate dictator of what truth is by my response of my body. And I just thought that was an interesting thing. So to hear you say that was just kind of interesting.
Yeah, and it's like, well, but also hearing me talk about like my church upbringing and like how anti feelings we were, to think about me at the beginning, like I feel like often in the early stages of deconstruction, you almost go to the other extreme, and I feel
Yeah.
like that's exactly what I did. Like I was like, okay, the Bible's not the ultimate authority. What's the thing they said? Like, definitely don't make this your ultimate authority. And I kind of made it that. And I
Yeah.
think that there's like value in that. Like, kind of as I'm thinking, I'm like, okay, hear me out. I feel like potentially it's okay in different seasons for your like ultimate authority to be something different, almost to undo some of the bad ultimate authority that you had beforehand. Like you almost need to go to the other extreme in order to like find some common ground. But what
Yeah.
I'm
I
also
can.
thinking about, sorry.
No, I was gonna say I can hear what you're saying. I don't know that I like think that's a good or a bad idea, but I understand what you're saying.
I agree. I'm not sure I'm like, I love this, but I think that it's what happened. And I think it
I think it's
happens
what we
often.
do.
Yeah.
I think it's
I
like
mean,
in just humanity, it's what we do.
well, even just like I'm getting really into cooking right now. And for example, if something is too um like sweet, you want to add like salt or add like acid. Like, and so sometimes you add more than you should have because there's more of a certain ingredient before and it was like it didn't taste good. And so you're having to
Right.
like add more of the opposite in order to counteract the flavor. And I think that
Yeah.
there's something similar there. The other thing I'm thinking though is that last episode, what I said is that what I was hoping for my faith in 2024 is that there would be more consistency. And what I
Mm.
think is like when you ask that question of like, okay, but what's like, what is your guiding thing? Like, what's your compass? And my immediate thought was like, I don't even know at all. Like, I don't really feel like I have one. I do feel like if the desire is consistency, you need some sort of compass.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, right? Like that's also a good observation. Like it would be hard to have consistency without something guiding you in the same consistent direction, you know?
But I mean, like, would you say your like your guiding compass? I'm assuming you would say is like Jesus and not the Bible.
Uh, I believe the Bible is 100% inerrant. The King James Version is my ultimate guiding authority. Yeah, so I mean, I would say Jesus, right? But I would also say like the Bible is my ultimate authority. But I also don't mean like I would almost never say that to someone because of what people think I mean when I say that. And so what I don't mean is like I take everything literal in the Bible. I don't mean that. But I think like if you can take the Bible as an entire work. And as I often refer to it, and I don't think I made this up, but like the story of God in us, like is how I would always say it. Like everything about it, and specifically the Gospels, but I also don't like to say that because then we throw away all the hard stuff. And I think the hard stuff is important from the Old Testament. I think the argument and arguing in the New Testament's important. I think all like the weird psychedelic stuff in Revelation's important. So I think like all of that helps paint the picture. Um, so yeah, like for me, the Bible is that authority, but like it isn't authoritarian where it's like it's do this or believe exactly what I tell you or you're gonna burn. You know what I mean? Like it's much more like a parent with like the best hope for you and like saying like here are the options and here's what I know to be good for you, and I'm going to give you some agency to like navigate that. Not a complete analogy. It sounded better in my mind as I was thinking about it, but I think like for me the Bible is that, but it's also not all or nothing, and it's not like 100% literal makes it like the authority doesn't come from literalness for me.
No, I mean, I think I dig that. Like, I think in a lot of ways, if you think of the Bible as something that, again, I know I've said the story before, but like the first time I ever heard you preach, you were talking about Galatians, and you were like, this is people trying to figure out how to follow Jesus. And I was just like, that is so much more accessible. And in some ways, almost like more, I mean, definitely more compelling than being like, this is Paul telling you what to do. And
Yeah.
so I think there definitely is a way that the Bible, I mean, I think like you model it, and I think in general, I think progressive Christianity models it in the sense that the Bible can be an authority without being inerrant.
Yeah, this is a complete tangent. Talking, except for you, like you had mentioned, like come hearing my first sermon, and we've mentioned that you went to Westminster before. Anytime like a Christian school person, or specifically a well Bible verse Westminster person, trickles in and hears me preach for the first time, their BS meter is through the roof. Like trying to like, what is this wackadoodle gonna say? And I was just thinking about like that from, I don't know if that was in your mind or not, but many people will come in and like they'll say positive things after, but like they come in and say something defective. Like I was trying to figure out ways to like not like what you were gonna say or prove you wrong or something like that based on like what they were taught. And as you're saying that, it just popped into my mind. But when like the Bible is your ultimate authority, just based on itself and like it being the Bible is what is the proof that it's the Bible, like that it's the Word of God. It's like it's self proclaiming, I guess, right? Like it proves itself. And then someone says something like, well, this is just us trying to work it out, and this was them trying to work it out. Those two things can't be congruent together. And that can immediately like throw people off when you've been told this is authoritative. And then someone like me is like, well, in this letter, it's really people just wrestling with what it means to live out their faith in their era. And we can take that and parlay it into our time too, you know?
For sure. Did you, when I was listening, the first time I came, I don't think you knew I was a Westminster person though, right?
No. I wasn't even thinking about you. I was thinking about there was some Westminster people that just came, and I think it was a group of their first time, and they're all very very sweet people, and I think had a really great time. But I can always see like, I mean, I think people just assume when they think progressive Christian that I'm just going to talk about peace and love and like self betterment, and that I probably won't ever talk about scripture or Jesus at all. Which is not usually how I preach. Like I try not to do. I try to like talk about the Bible, but I think the assumption of like progressive Christianity is like it's more like self-help guru stuff than it is like Jesus stuff, which is sometimes a fair critique.
I thought I saw this like random video the other day, like a reel on Instagram or something, and it said like this is actually a completely other conversation, but now I've started it, so I guess I'm gonna keep going.
We're going there.
That said like it was someone who I guess I would have considered a fundamentalist, but maybe he had a different definition who shared it. And he said like the issue, like fundamentalist Christianity and progressive Christianity both have the same issue in the sense that they like go to an extreme on what is like optional.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm bringing this up because it's going to be a whole conversation, but like, but in a sense, like he was saying, the fundamentalist Christians make nothing optional. Like they say, like how you dress is
Yeah.
like it's got to be this, or how you speak, or what you eat, or like whatever. Nothing is optional. And then he was like, but on the other extreme, progressive Christianity made everything optional. And I was like listening to that, and I was like, okay, first of all, that's interesting. Second of all, I'm not really sure that that's how I would classify progressive Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can see both sides. Like, I think that that's a little all or nothing on both sides, but I think it's also like somewhat fair. It's like on the more conservative side, it's like we want to like the Bible's the authority. We're the authority. There's no wiggle room. And so we're going to tell you and mandate. And in the really fundamentalist ones, it's like goes down to dress and everything. And very much, I mean, I think they're very like there are certain progressives that would be like, you are not progressive, Danny. And I think you go really far either way, you can have that issue. And there are people that I do think it's like everything is up for grabs. And I actually kind of like that in some ways, because it helps people, like when everything's up for grabs, you have to decide what you want to cling to. And then if you cling to the important things, or the things that I guess my faith would tell me are important, so then I purport, then I think it means you care more about them. If someone just tells me, believe this because it's important, I would never choose that. Like, that's not how my brain would work. So I would naturally gravitate to like everything's in the air and I can choose what I'm grabbing, rather than the you believe this or you're a heretic. I would be like, well, this is the worst and I'm not doing that. But I like don't like being told what to do. So that would be a hard place for me to exist.
I really like how you said that, and it kind of is helpful, and I think maybe a nice way to like land the plane for this episode. But because I was thinking of like if everything's optional and sometimes everything does feel up in the air, sometimes it feels like it leads to a spiritual place that I kind of feel like I'm in now, where I'm like, I just like don't even know.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think your perspective is helpful in a sense that, yeah, you can feel lost, especially if maybe you're not putting in the effort to like, okay, I'm gonna look through everything that's up in the air and figure out like what I'm gonna cling to and what my compass is and what my beliefs are. It can feel very chaotic and very like lost. But I think what you said is helpful, that this season is somewhat important if you want your faith to like be your own versus someone. I think it's hard when you've been told like you have to believe this, you have to believe this, all of a sudden to have like a billion options.
Yeah, well, that's kind of actually what I was saying, a little bit of the dichotomy of like when you're talking about that radical book versus the ordinary book. It's like your faith was never your own. So therefore, you can't be like, it is not your faith. It is God's blessing that God gave you, and you are just like helplessly receiving it. And so there's a difference between like being an active participant and being my faith versus being like, I'm just a awful person that God puts up with, and then my like it's a very different space to be in. And so the idea of like having agency and grabbing the things and then caring about them more, like for you, like caring about them more initially probably was never the thing. It's like, this is just what I was given. It's the right thing. And I think about it the same way I think about the Pythagorean theorem. It's correct and it exists and it's just here for me to have my whole life, It's another fact for me to have in my brain.
Right. And I think we talked about this a little bit ago in our rebellion versus freedom episode. But I think kind of like what we said in like our first episodes, when I was like, I'm listening to my feelings, I'm listening to my body, which like I don't necessarily take back. Like I think there's a lot of beauty and good and like healing that I needed to do through that belief. Do I think
Yeah.
I was maybe a little extreme? Probably. But like I think that I needed that in that moment, whether or not that is like good. But like that still wasn't me really choosing what I believe. It was
Yeah.
me still being like controlled by past beliefs by like doing a full 180. Like that
Yeah.
still isn't really your choice because you're picking the exact opposite, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, Dustin and I got coffee today, and we talked a little bit about like he just listened to the episode that came out on Tuesday, so it's 80, and he was talking about how we talked about the chapters and stuff, and we talked about the chapter you're in now, and I do think in some ways like you definitely are. This is like one of your maybe the last chapter of your life, whatever. Your first two chapters or whatever, you were still clinging to where
Yes.
you were coming from, even if it was like rebelling with it or whatever, doing the opposite or 180. And this seems like the first chapter where you're like kind of free from everything. But I also sense that you feel somewhat, you've said this, lost, but like the loss might just feel like the first time you've ever experienced not being attached to something. And so it's like you're just more untethered, which isn't bad, but it does give you options to tether to other things. But this is the first time where you're not just like doing a 180 or running away or rebelling. It's like I'm just finally floating in the ether and ready to grab a hold of something which feels disorienting and maybe more like you're lost, but it's kind of like an opportunity to grab a hold of things whenever you decide to.
That's
if you
actually
say
really helpful. Right.
so.
No, I mean, I know that that's something that I want. I think just like, I think in many ways that untethered feeling, that word is like totally hitting the nail on the head. And I don't think it's one I could have come up with myself or like named myself. But I think in feeling untethered, but also being in a place of just like exhaustion from a million other things and not really like actively seeking to tether. I feel like I'm just like lost and lazy. And maybe that is partly true, but it's like I think to the way that we are framing this like new season, to me, I guess I was envision like seeing this season before today as just like almost like the anti-season. Like Emily's not really doing anything with her faith. When in reality, I think this is still like a part of the deconstruction process. And even if I'm not being as much of an active participant as I should or could be, that doesn't really mean that the process isn't happening.
Yeah, in some ways, look at it somewhat like the very literal creation story that I cling to, I believe, very literally, word for word. No, but like so, like the creation story, right? Like all of the work gets done, and then there's the Sabbath rest, right? Like you've done a lot of work, and so now it's like you're kind of in
Mm.
a season of rest, which rest isn't lazy, and rest isn't even inactivity, but rest is like pausing from the active work, and that's you're kind of in like a deconstruction Sabbath day, Sabbath season now, which is like you just need to rest more than anything, uh, which is why that was built into what our spiritual practices should be. It's like rest is important.
Dang, I gotta be honest, this conversation has just been like very encouraging and like in many ways like definitely what I needed to hear. Cause I think like even coming into recording the past few times, I've been like, I don't even know how much I have to say because I just haven't been doing that active work versus like in those early episodes where I was just like my mind was just going and going and going. And I had so I always like every time I walked into the studio, I had like a billion things on my mind. And it just doesn't feel that way right now. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's lazy, and that doesn't mean that God isn't working or that stuff isn't happening. It like
Yeah.
it could just be a season of Sabbath. I honestly I really needed to hear that. So thank you.
Yeah. I love getting a chance. We took a big break from doing this, so it's been fun the last like 2 weeks to like build back this rhythm. And like I said, you're one of the people I've talked to. You're in my Mount Rushmore of conversation hours this past year, and so it's good to like, or this, yeah, 2023. So 2024, we're gonna do it again. Well, hey, so I think your dogs are ready to get loose, and my dog child is ready to get loose. So why don't we end with a quick recommendation station before we wrap this up? Do you have a recommendation? Anything you're into right now?
Yeah. I this is actually one, this is like a little bit of a late recommendation, I guess. This was the last book I read in 2023, but I was just talking
Okay.
about it with Tyler today, so it's on my mind. But I read this book
Yeah.
called Pizza Girl. It was like the last book I read in 2023, kind of randomly. I read a book and then I think it recommended like if you like this, you should read this. And so I was like, whatever, it's pretty short. And I really liked it. It's this debut novel for this young author, and it's kind of weird. It's about this like young 18-year-old girl who is like pregnant and working as a pizza delivery girl, but just is like super lost and is just like not really dealing with any of the things she needs to deal with. Maybe I
Okay.
related to it. I mean, not really. Like I'm not 18 and pregnant and a pizza girl, but like the idea of just a character that is pretty like lost and trying to figure it out, but also making a lot of mistakes along the way. But it is also like very weird and quirky and dark. And she like kind of becomes obsessed with one of the people she delivers pizza to. It's very difficult to explain, but if you're looking for like a
Sounds
dark,
interesting.
quirky read that's pretty short, I'd be interested to hear anyone's thoughts on it because I liked it a
Any,
lot.
Okay, it's like a dark comedy kind of like that's the idea of it.
I mean, it's not terribly dark, but like there definitely are pretty dark moments. And I
okay.
don't know. I feel like no one is talking about this book, and I think that I thought it was very well done. What about
Okay.
you?
That's an interesting. My recommendation would be, and I don't recommend a lot of cartoons, though you've recommended a few. But I've just started season 2 of What If, um, which is like a Marvel show. It's on Disney Plus. The first 2 episodes were like fine. I mean, they were good. ish. I didn't find them that exciting, but like episodes 3 and 4, like this, it's very much like the first season. Like it's starting to ramp up to something that's going to culminate with the final episode. Um, so I think that I've been really digging it. Also, I don't think we recorded since I finished Loki season 2, which was hands down the best thing I've watched in 2023. It was so good. Yeah, it was incredible. And for anyone that's not like a superhero person, like go watch like a spoiler filled season 1 recap and then go watch season 2 and you'll love it.
Do you watch all those Marvel shows?
Not really. I've watched a few of them. Like I watched WandaVision, which I loved. That was really fun. I watched both Lokis, but I haven't like watched a lot. I'm not a big Captain America guy, and so like I haven't watched like any of his movies or those shows. And there's been a few like more like a rated R one that just came out or is about to come out, and like I haven't watched that. But I kind of want to, but I just don't watch a lot of TV. And when I sit and watch a cartoon for sure next to Annie, she's like, "This is the worst thing I've ever experienced," because she hates cartoons. She's like, "I married an adult, and I can't believe this person's watching a cartoon next to me." But it's been so good. I've really dug it.
I dig that. Our stance on the deconstruction zone is like you can watch an animated show as an adult. I think sometimes they like lift reality a little bit so you can like get more into the story in a way that
That is almost exactly what I thought. I was like watching it, and I was like, "This story couldn't have happened with real people." And I was like, and it made it so much better because it was able to be animated and it like elevated. It was really, really good.
So I
I
was,
dig it.
yeah.
So, well, hey, this was a fun episode. Why don't you send us out and we'll be back again next week and we'll do it again.
All right. Well, everybody, as always, thank you so much for listening and embrace the journey. Pretty
Woof.
close.